Yes, we're live. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to have here with us Professor Sam Cowling. Sam is Associate Professor at Denison University. He's the author of the forthcoming Philosophy of Comics book, co-authored with Wesley Cray, and the very famous, I should say, book Abstract Entities from 2017, published by Routledge. He's the author of several articles, including on humanism and other theoretical virtues, naturalism and non-qualitative properties, recombining non-qualitative reality, and also the entry for Hayek-Saitism in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So, Sam, we're very excited to have you here. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. Let me try and share some screen here and see whether this is running okay. Can you see Superman and Sherlock Holmes and sort of me somewhere on your screen too? Awesome. Thanks, you guys. Italo, thanks so much for this conference. It's been a delight to talk about metaphysical fiction, hear folks chime in on these very strange issues. I want to do, my hope for this sort of session is a pretty light one, to kind of introduce some problems, talk through a couple of different options. And then at the end, I'll sort of bump into an issue that I'm somewhat vexed by and have very haphazard thoughts with respect to. So I do want there to be a few sort of takeaways. So I'm going to dive, I think, pretty intensely, pretty quickly into some nooks and crannies of fictional realism and think about certain theses of creation independence that come up in the kind of fictional realist framework, and just sort of explore them and their prospects. I'll introduce this puzzle. I call it the puzzle of fictional orphans. I confess to not loving the term orphan, but it was sort of the fictionally unemployed was another one. And it's just all, I settle in orphans. If somebody can figure sort of a better bit of terminology, I'll eagerly adopt it. But I want to spend some time worrying about them. I think they're a sort of peculiar class of fictional entities that, for understandable reasons, have received kind of short shrift. And then I'm going to sort of gesture haphazardly towards a kind of untenable solution regarding these orphan fictional critters. It's partly by way of saddling up to a bigger problem or worry I have about fictional ontology that I'm trying to make some headway on. So I hope to leave lots of time for us to just kind of chat about stuff. All right, so, Italo University were kind enough to invite me to talk about the sort of comic stuff. I'm super eager to do so. As I mentioned, I've got a book coming out soon with my colleague Wesley Cray about some of this stuff. I think that this conference is a nice counterexample to a trend, because I think we saw some examples from Deadpool the other day, that the sort of diet of examples from which the sort of philosophy of fiction is historically drawn is pretty impoverished or pretty skewed in a certain direction. It is premised upon what I'll just call the standard case. You're all sort of familiar with it. This is a bit of idealization here, but a purely textual fiction. It has a unique author, a sort of single individual that's producing it. The production is more or less simple. That is, somebody sits down and thinks hard for a little while and starts writing some stuff, and thus and so we have a text. It's principally non-serialized, and this is a more, I think, nastier read. It's serialized work that philosophers pretend was originally non-serialized. So you can think about your examples from Dickens and Holmes, et cetera, that we just sort of pretend is a non-serial work. And there's been some really neat work on truth in fiction as it pertains to serial fictions lately. So I think that sort of trend has changed. It's perhaps telling that instead of looking to sort of robustly serialized historical fictional forms, people have decided to talk about Star Wars, but here we are. The standard case remains sort of narratively isolated. That is, it's a kind of freestanding work of fiction that's can be considered in relative isolation from other works of fiction, even though it's sort of imbued by the sort of hermeneutic background of interpretation. They're typically premised upon fiction-based medium here. So if we take a novel, a sort of criterial mark of being a novel is that it's a fiction, then working with the sort of genre of the novel or the form of the novel as your example, it's really easy because novels are fiction-based mediums in this sense. You might think similar arcs attend to plays. So I think Hamlet and Sherlock Holmes are our defaults. And then there's a substantial length that the sort of typical fiction with which we're working is the kind of thing that affords a certain amount of literary or fictive reflection. There's phenomena like anticipation, backwards and forward lookings reference, etc. And so, when you bump into the sort of standard case, let me see if I can fix this. I love thinking about the case of comics for a variety of reasons, but one of them is just to think about the ways in which it departs from the standard case. Comics are hybrids, in at least one sense of hybrids, where they're bringing together both the presentation of text and image. Their production, just focusing on sort of what you might think of as kind of mainstream comics, is tremendously convoluted, both in the way in which it unfolds over time, but the sort of creative team is this weird mishmash of editors, writers, pencilers, inkers, colorists, etc. They're often intensively serialized. That is, it's not clear that we can speak about certain of these comics as ever, as it were, being completed because of a certain conception of serialization. They're narratively integrated with one another in these really remarkable ways. There's a sense in which a character pops up and your understanding of that character is only aptly informed by other comics and not even the one that you're attending to. Well, I think most of us, when we think about comics, think about a medium that's principally engaged in fictional storytelling. It's suits itself to non-fictional media, non-fictional storytelling all over the place. And then, of course, just the length is tremendously variable. There's a fun debate in the philosophy of comics about which kinds of things are actually comics and whether sort of single panel comics might count. That would be your lower bound on length. But here we just see works of fiction that are remarkably different from the standard case. And in the book, we sort of make a case for why we ought to like fictional realism. And I think it's a testament to fictional realism that you begin with a standard case, and albeit there's a need for certain tweaks and adjustments, but it's a remarkable testament to the power of that theory that it readily accommodates a case that's profoundly different in nature from the sort of standard case. So there is the sense in which fictional realism emerges as this really attractive theoretical framework for making sense of storytelling just across different media. And that's the kind of starting point for today. So I'm just going to kind of put on a fictional realist hat and roll with it as follows. I'm happy to kind of wring my hands about the plausibility of that view later on. I hope some of us, I detect a kind of broad enthusiasm for the view from the sort of past talks, but I hope we can kind of chop it up a little bit in the Q&A. So, why be a fictional realist in the case of comics? I guess we can in principle imagine somebody sort of being a fictional realist about the standard case, but just abstaining from realism with regard to fictional comics characters, etc. But there's just a way in which you poke around the critical practice of comics and you just find the kind of data that requires an explanation by way of fictional realism. So here's one from the Comics Journal in 1984. It's kind of the preeminent comics periodical. The 30-year-old British character Marvel Man, which is owned by London's Quality Communications, has become an object of contention. If you read this really literally, we've got an argument for it being an object. Marvel's British arm, Marvel Comics Limited, is asking Quality to cease publication of Marvel Man on the grounds of copyright infringement. Ironically, the Marvel Man character has been in existence longer than the United States Marvel Comics Group, having been created and copyrighted in 1954. You can't really ask for a better example of sort of fictional realism and the kind of data which it's designed to explain than this one, insofar as it points to the creation of the character, the ownership of the character, and the literal use of existence of the character, right? So this is the kind of example that it's easy for the fictional realist to be excited about upon seeing. Quick update about 40 years later, Marvel Comics now owns Marvel Man, which has been retitled Miracle. So what does fictional realism look like? I want to focus on kind of what it'll take to sort of be three core elements of fictional realism. I think one really fun question is how detachable these elements are and what constitutes the kind of internal core of fictional realism versus the sort of protective belt, if you want to think in Lakatoshian terms. The sort of ontological core is just the claim that, you know, something like Superman exists, Marvel Man exists, fictional characters exist, there are fictional characters. There's the semantic core too, where it comes to sort of names of fictional characters, that the names of these fictional characters, regardless of whether they're being deployed in textual uses like Marvel Man flies, sort of paratextual uses according to the Marvel Man stories, Marvel Man flies, and these metatextual uses, Marvel Man is the subject of copyright dispute. That term is referring to the same thing across those uses. So there's this kind of unfettered semantic access to these characters that's part of the kind of fictional realist framework. So part of it's just the heritage of the kind of direct reference theory that you can think about when we think about Kripke. But then there's a sort of third core, which I'll just call the analytic core, is that there's going to be variable relations that these characters can stand into properties, right? So we get a variety, sort of a profusion of terminology. I'll be really loose throughout what follows. Just think about Marvel Man holding, encoding, being ascribed the property being able to fly, and this kind of being some sort of degenerate second-rate sort of relationship that a character can have to a property, versus the kind of the really good one, the one that with which we're more familiar with regard to natural language and sort of predication in the wild, is that Marvel Man has, instantiates, exemplifies the property of being the subject of a copyright dispute. So take that to be your kind of core of fictional realism, and then the sort of application of the fictional realist framework here just does a nice job of making sense of big chunks of the critical practice surrounding comics. And in what follows, I'm just going to kind of take that critical practice as a kind of starting point. All right, so let's look a little bit deeper into the kind of remarks that we find with regard to fictional realism. Here's Kripke, Vacuous Names and Fictional Entities. The question of fictional characters' existence is a question about the actual world. It depends on whether certain works have actually been written, certain stories in fiction have actually been told. The fictional character can be regarded as an abstract entity which exists in virtue of the activities of human beings, in the same way that nations are abstract entities which exist in virtue of the activities of human beings and their interrelations. A fictional character exists if human beings have done certain things, namely created certain works of fiction and the characters in them. So the sort of last, I guess the last bit of the conjunct is redundant, but the first part says a fictional character, roughly speaking, exists just insofar as certain works of fiction get created. That's going to be a bit of a focus in what follows here. I think it's fictional realism construed broadly, subsumes certain kind of possibilist frameworks. This is the kind of supplement to what I said previously that converts the view into what I would think of as the kind of artifactualist view. So we can think about fictional characters as these artifacts that are subject to certain kinds of metaphysical analogies with, you know, things like cakes, sandwiches, and houses. They are artifacts. But again, the thing I'll just note here in the sort of Kripkean case is that we're imagining the creation of characters qua artifacts via the production of certain works. All right. Here's Amy Thomason. So if you're a comics head, you might hate this Christian Marclay piece up top. It's a piece of quote unquote fine art, which is worth about $50,000. But of course, it's just a couple pieces of sort of arbitrary comics lettering glued together. I should be noting some of these images as we go. This is a drawing by Steve Ditko as he's subsequently litigating the debate about who created Spider-Man. But this is attended as, you know, as is the style, with a quote from Amy Thomason. If we treat fictional characters as creations invented by authors, so for artifactualists, in creating works of literature and existing because of their appearance in such works, then it seems that for a fictional character to be preserved, some literary work about it must remain in existence, and so we have uncovered a second dependency. Characters depend on the creative acts of their authors in order to come into existence, and depend on literary works in order to remain in existence. So the Thomasonian Kripkean views are close in various familiar ways, but here we're getting kind of one sort of thesis about creation that Thomason's noting, that if we treat them as fictional characters being created by virtue of the production of these works, then we might also want to hold on to a second thesis, a thesis of metaphysical dependence. I think the most natural way to think about this is kind of a grounding thesis, that, you know, you've got the work, and then, as it were, the work grounds the character. The character is grounded by the work. Obviously, the development of the Thomason and Kripkean sort of lines on these questions sort of predates the fetishization of grounding across metaphysics, but I think we can take it to be the sort of dependence thesis. So here's just a couple theses that emerge pretty standardly in discussions about fictional realism, partly on account of Kripke and Thomason's remarks. So one, The first two are sort of theses about creation. Authorial practices allow for the creation of fictional works and fictional characters. This is the broadest one. Without this one, we don't really get artifactualism off the ground. Just noting that you can't really create these things unless certain practices are in play. That is, in a sort of same way that, if we didn't have butts, we couldn't create chairs, right? Or something like that. But the sort of more nuanced one here is authorial practices create fictional characters by creating fictional works. So the sort of story about the production of fictional characters is sort of tethered to the production of fictional works. So those are just theses about creation, and the theses about dependence. So fictional entities depend upon our fiction-related practices. No practices, no fictional ontology, no fictional entities of any class. And then second claim, fictional works depend upon our fiction-related practices. So this is the sort of idea that fictional works exist, but depend upon our practices. And then the sort of tertiary claim, fictional characters depend upon fictional works. So, I think it's 3 and 2 are going to be the sort of principal focus of what I want to talk about today. So here's just some remarks about sort of what you can think of as like the kind of characters via works thesis. So here's Brock. Fictional characters are not brought into being by gods, philosophers, or literary critics. They are created by the authors of the stories in which they first appear. This just tethers the sort of implicit in this is the idea we're creating characters by creating the stories in which they first appear. Here's a Nathan Salmon quote about what Kripke says, which I can't find anywhere in the Kripkean corpus, not even in the sort of scanned Locke lectures. Kripke believes that a fictional character does not come into existence until the final draft of the fiction is published. I love how nuanced and granular this is. Granularity is probably an explanation of why I can't find it in print anywhere. Here's Thomason again. Because characters depend on literary works, anything on which literary works depend is also ultimately something on which characters depend. And then Jeffrey Goodman, I think. Holmes, for example, exists because the intentional acts of Doyle brought him into existence here, and they serve to bring him into existence elsewhere. Holmes is ontologically dependent on Doyle and Doyle's literary works. So that's the third thesis of dependence there. A little bit of a funky thesis to unpack. If you really do think that Holmes depends on Doyle and he's a presentist, and you realize Doyle is dead, we should be worried. But we'll focus on the sort of latter claim that depends on Doyle's literary works. All right, so I want to worry about these sort of familiar claims of dependence. I have a pretty philosophically unsophisticated way of worrying about them. So it's not based on any principles about the supplementation of weak grounds. I just started reading a lot about how comics are made, and that doing so made me worry about these theses. More sophisticated philosophers would point out this is some kind of appeal to critical practice. That is, we've approached the metaphysics of fiction with a healthy interest in systematic metaphysics. But it turns out sort of careful reflection on critical practice raises questions about the sort of aptness of this tidy, broadly a prioristic kind of metaphysical framework. So this just some remarks pulled from Fantagraphic's sort of guide to the X-Men. So in 1972, artist Dave Cockrum was drawing the DC book Superboy, starring a legion of superheroes. He developed a range of characters, only some of which appeared in Legion. Upon moving to Marvel, Nightcrawler, among others, appeared in Uncanny X-Men. So you see Nightcrawler making his appearance in Giant Size X-Men #1 in 1975. And here's Dave Cockrum. When I became a pro, I was doing Legion of Superheroes. I proposed 4 new Legionnaires, and Nightcrawler was one of them. But Murray Boltinoff's response was that he was too weird looking. And so the idea here is that this is early Cockrum art that sort of pulls together a bunch of characters, some of which subsequently appear in Legion of Superheroes, some of which appear elsewhere. So it turns out actually there's a longer story about Cockrum. He was sort of stationed in Guam in the US military and was apparently obsessing about Nightcrawler when he was supposed to be sort of painting planes. Here's another example that Cockrum talks about, though, in sort of when he was hired to start working on the X-Men. It'd be interesting to include a Batwing character. I never addressed the question of whether he was actually a vampire or not, but I'd imagine that either he wasn't or that Professor X had come up with some sort of serum which allowed him to control blood urges. But the others involved in restarting the new X-Men, Thomas Wayne Claremont and a couple others, the editorial staff were convincing and felt that Vampire and Nightcrawler were visually similar types. And if it came to crunch, personally, I preferred Nightcrawler. Thus, our characters left on the cutting room floor. So I'm going to kind of roll through some more examples and then kind of do a little bit of a wrap up on the section. So here's Sean Howe's sort of lovely book, sort of Marvel, the Untold Story, which sort of goes through the kind of history of Marvel Comics. In the space of a week, Lee and Kirby, that's Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, came up with a misfit group of heroes called the Inhumans and a handsome black hero called the Coal Tiger. But it turned out that DC, which still controlled Marvel's distribution, wouldn't allow Goodman to publish the extra titles anyway. So the new characters were set aside until they could be worked into the Fantastic Four as players in what would be the most adventurous stories that Marvel had ever attempted. Here's Joe Simon recounting sort of the early days of 1950 sort of publishing. Simon, one of the sort of famous co-creators of Captain America. Stan Lee called Kirby in and asked him if he had any comics characters lying around that hadn't been used. As I learned years later, Jack brought in the Spider-Man logo that I'd loaned him before we changed the name to the Silver Spider. I love this idea of just, as it were, comic characters just sitting around unused, whether we might, as it were, deploy them. Peter, you got a hand up. You have a question? Nope. Okay. All right. So just think about these sorts of cases. I take this sort of unifying theme in all of them to be the idea that critical practice surrounding comics involves the production of characters in ways that precede the production of works in which they actually appear. Right. There's sort of just a couple things to note, that there's aesthetic debate about them, that there's, as it were, aesthetic ranking of these characters, the reflection on Nightcrawler versus Vampire, this idea that we can think about different options with respect to inserting characters into different stories, into different works, and a certain kind of, we can think actually about a certain degree of variability and debates about the sort of nature and existence of these characters over time preceding their work. So you can imagine a hardline reader saying, no, it's essential to the Black Panther that he be named the Black Panther. This character, the Coal Tiger, is distinct from Black Panther. That would be fine, but each of those hypotheses both seem to presuppose that we're talking about the existence of characters in ways that antedate works in which they putatively appear. So that's just a kind of reflection on sort of comics practice. We find again and again sort of talk about these characters existing prior to works. So I take authorial critical practice around comics are no more or less relevant fictional practice surrounding novels, plays, and other stories. I take it that standard authorial and critical practice surrounding comics support the claim that some fictional characters exist prior to comics featuring them. And if fictional characters can exist prior to comics featuring them, then the case that, and it's not the case that fictional characters are created only by creating fictional works, and it's not the case that characters must depend upon the fictional works, right? So I think the natural way to take the creation thesis and dependent thesis is necessitated claims. That is, the way in which all characters are created is by the production of works, and the relationship that characters stand to works is, of necessity, characters depend upon works. At a minimum, if you take these examples at more or less face value, it just shows that those claims can't be necessarily true. So it looks like, I think it's probably the case that if we approach the metaphysics of fiction with a kind of analogy to the sort of metaphysics of the material world, the first thing you start doing is hunting for systematic dependence theses, sort of law-like regularities in the structure of reality. And when we come to fiction, it's clear that the one that feels most tempting to most folks is this idea of characters depending upon works. But it looks like once we sort of poke around through the actual critical practices, the phenomenon is just vastly messier than we thought, and the standard thesis of systematic dependence, as well as the thesis about creation, just ought to be abandoned. So how would you respond to this sort of weird example, right? So like Cowling reads a bunch of weird peripheral stuff about comics and says, hey, there's so much the worse for metaphysics. What's the sort of menu of potential responses? Obviously, sort of a very appealing and natural one is just deny that characters are created in the examples just produced, right? So just, no, you didn't successfully create Vampire. Coal Tiger wasn't created until you actually generate the sort of Fantastic Four story in which he appears. So you might say, well, comics creators produce drawings or outlines or proto-characterological templates. But whatever these things are, they are insufficient for the actual generation of characters. This is a less storied comics creator, Rob Liefeld, noting that this is a character that I've been wanting to use for some time now. He's a futuristic warrior, a concept that I never get tired of experimenting with. So it's doubtless the case that some of the things that comics creators produce in the activities of preparing for comics are probably not the kind of things that we'd feel comfortable saying involve the creation of characters, but it does look at face value like any of the standards that we sort of deploy to assess them as characters. They do seem to meet these sort of these thresholds, the kinds of debates we can have about them, the idea that we might rank and come up with carefully honed intentional plans about unfolding artworks on the basis of them. So I think there's just substantial authority in critical practice that presupposes talk about the identity and distinctness of characters, as well as, there's substantial disagreement about credit and ownership that hangs on character-related activities prior to the production of these works. So there's ample number of lawsuits that hinge upon the creation of characters even before they show up in the works themselves. If our diet of examples here was too meager and the claims were too anecdotal, I'd be really happy to just say, yeah, look, these are probably people being mistaken about what they're in fact producing in advance of the works. But I think we just do find a preponderance of evidence that, at least in comics, there is a character that character production can predate works and works in which characters appear. What's another sort of response? I mean, I think some of us might be tempted by a kind of, this is just old news cowling. If you think about worries about fictional characters predating relevant fictional works, it's going to be a problem that arises for novels and plays as well, right? So this is why we get that sort of weird remark from Kripke, or the remark that Salmon attributes to Kripke, that it's like, no, it needs to be the final draft. Because there's this kind of worry about producing fictional characters in advance of an absolutely final draft, and the kind of puzzles about the relationship to one another. So there is clearly, profound worries about vagueness and individuation here. I guess the one point I want to make, just with respect to this charge that it's just old news, is that worries about drafts and revisions do arise across a bunch of different mediums. I just think this comic character creation involves a generation work that just don't seem to be assimilated to drafts. When Dave Cockrum is creating Vampire, he's not creating a draft of a comic book. So it's not properly assimilated in the case of somebody who's writing a first draft of, Holmes' story. They're doing something that's characterological in nature, that's sort of exhaustively focused on the production of this thing rather than the thing in which it would appear. So I think it's, we can imagine deploying similar strategies, but I do think on balance, this is sort of new news. So how do we want to try and respond to it? I think, there is a very real danger that when we start doing the metaphysics of fiction, we impose too many morals from the metaphysics of the actual world, right? So if you think about a kind of, broadly Aristotelian metaphysics of the actual world with substances and predicates, and maybe you want to infuse it with regions, now we can say, well, look, fictional reality has got to be this kind of weird mirror of actual reality. So there's going to be these fictional categories like plots, settings, characters, and stories. Stories are world-like, settings are region-like, characters are substance-like, and so on. And one sort of worry here is that it's simply not clear why we'd think the internal metaphysical structure of fictional reality would be so nicely behaved and mirror in various ways the kind of internal structure of what you might think is concrete reality. So you might just think that this idea of a distinction between works and characters is actually on its own not very tenable, that we talk about there's this sort of distinction with works and characters because of certain superficial features of fictional discourse. But upon close reflection, we should probably just give up the idea that there's this separable categories of stories and characters. There's something much stranger going on. So you might just have this independent reason to reject character work dependence because you hate this idea that there's really this distinction between characters and works. One way to warm up to it above is Richard Case's drawing of a character from Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, Danny the Street. Danny is a street. So in that sense, a setting, but of course becomes a really important and interesting queer character in Doom Patrol. So it's this kind of thing that moves between these sort of fictional categories of setting and character. If you're a Sandman fan, you can think about Fiddler's Green here. So you might just be skeptical about the broader metaphysical apparatus we're bringing to fictional realism in the first place. I'm sympathetic to that. I'll walk back some stuff in a little bit. I do think, though, that if you do take critical practice seriously, we are under substantial pressure to think that there is differences between characters and stories, fictional properties, et cetera. And you can just think about the practice that involve, for example, transporting one character one way or another to another story, thinking about character-based homages. There is, it would do violence to prima facie critical practice to just say there's no distinction between characters and works, but it might take, maybe a challenge to recover it. So I'm going to assume sort of the general trappings of fictional realism are still kind of in play and start worrying about what to do with respect to these kinds of characters. So One sort of maneuver that I think might be kind of tempting here, and I'm not going to have time to kind of work through its general plausibility, is what we call the sort of micro-fictionalist strategy. So the idea here is that there's a kind of necessary connection between characters and fictions, in the sense that each character is somehow shrouded in a kind of micro-fiction. So what we standardly think of as fictions are at least in part sort of aggregated micro-fictions, and then characters depend upon their micro-fictions. This would be a way, of course, to kind of uphold the sort of thesis of dependence, right? Because you say, well, look, there's the vampire microfiction that Cowling created, and that's the thing on which the character depends. I suppose what's sort of striking about this on face value, there's not much that characters ever do on this account. It's really just the micro-fictional shrouding of characters that do all their work. I think that this is the kind of metaphysical maneuver that feels attractive because of the sort of siren song of systematic metaphysics, but there's just not much in actual practice to pull out this kind of claim. It would be sort of a way of securing the dependence thesis that might feel familiar, but there's just little evidence that there are these little sort of micro-fictional works that we should be thinking about. I'll skip this sort of last worry. Another thesis that I don't think is going to have much plausibility is like, look, you look at the sort of literature on grounding, and the natural thing to do is if you've argued against thesis X, you just invert thesis X and sort of marshal this as an exciting and bold proposal with respect to metaphysical dependence. So maybe you just think that, like, if we've successfully shown on the basis of these characters that the general dependence of characters on works is false, maybe that's because we were just mistaken all along, and in fact, works depend upon characters. Right? You can kind of warm up to this if you start thinking about certain kinds of comic strips. You're just like, look, there's just no Garfield without Garfield. There's no Nancy without Nancy. And so, we should think that these the works in fact depend upon characters. And this would be, at least in principle, compatible with the idea of works being created in ways that precede, characters being created prior to works. I think this is a sort of dubious claim for a few reasons. I think it's possible to write fictions that are effectively characterless in nature, but even the sort of telltale examples, it's just not clear how you would find sufficient motivation for thinking that this dependence claim is in view. But I'm kind of eager to see somebody really go in on this hypothesis, so I note it just kind of briefly. Okay, so suppose that you take this sort of critical practice seriously and you want to start believing that there are these characters that can exist prior to works, focusing on the case of like Vampire, because that's a character that not only was created prior to work, but never actually appeared in any comics. I sort of call this character the sort of rejecting these theses of creation dependence invites a sort of weird class of fictional entities. I'll call them orphans. So these would be fictional characters that exist outside of fictional works. They have no, I guess, work-like parents. This it's a bad joke here. The sort of focal character from this Mike Allred, Peter Milligan drawing is called the Orphan. So this leaves us with a weird sort of question about the metaphysics fiction. What exactly are these orphans like? What kind of practices are they involved in? I mean, the example we've given of sort of an artistic practice is just the kind of practices that surround the early stages of production of comics. And then maybe what can they tell us about our broader engagement with characters? That last question is the one that I'm most vexed by, so I'll want to come back to it. I think as we try and make sense of fictional orphans and their sort of metaphysics, it's good to step back to the sort of general framework of fictional realism for a second, and just note that there's this move that's fairly standard when we're trotting out fictional realism to warm people up to it. And we sort of point out, say someone says, wait a second, you believe that Superman exists? And you point out, well, yes, Superman exists, but don't worry. I don't believe that Kryptonians exist. I don't believe that Superman flies. It's rather the case that I believe Superman is this fictional character that was created in 1938, that is owned by DC Comics, etc. And so I think this is in the bucket of the kind of protective belt around fictional realism, where to try and mitigate worries about being a realist about fictional characters, we then subsequently go on to say that they lack certain qualitative features. That is, they just fail to instantiate certain features that if we did hold them to have, it looks like the plausibility of the thesis would be severely compromised. But that actually doesn't tell us too much on the face of it. So just to take the example, here's an Ego the Living Planet from Lee and Kirby in '66. The good news for fictional realists is that Ego the Living Planet is neither a living nor a planet. Of course, Ego the Living Planet just has some modest historical properties, like being featured in Marvel Comics and being adapted into like a big MCU movie. So one question that we're left with when we start thinking about the case of Orphans is, what are they actually like? Their sort of positive characterization is limited to this kind of weird via negativa thing where we say, look, Ego the Living Planet is non-living. Ego the Living Planet is not a planet. It has some modest historical properties. But we're left without much beyond that with regard to metaphysics. You kind of think here, so let me see if I can skip ahead. I worry about this in part with a kind of analogy from sort of the ontology of mathematics. So there's the sort of metaphysical analogies between mathematical entities and fictional entities are sort of reasonably tolerably well explored. One thing that we sort of bump into in the sort of philosophy of mathematics at a various point, if you start worrying about Platonism enough, you start asking, well, what are these things like in and of themselves? What's their intrinsic nature, et cetera? And I think probably the most sort of commonsensical response shows up in Lewis's Parts of Classes. This is him talking about just sets, effectively. We were stumped by several questions about sets. Where, if anywhere, are they? What is their intrinsic nature? Do they differ qualitatively from one another? Is the relation of member to singleton founded on the qualitative nature of the relata? Or is it more like a distance relation? Or is it a mixture or something else altogether? We know nothing about their whereabouts or lack of it. We know nothing about their intrinsic qualitative character or lack of it. So I think once we start reflecting on fictional characters, and then especially in the sort of case of Orphans, we're left in this similarly weird position where we know what properties the fictional realist ought not ascribe to fictional entities, but beyond that, I think we're left with very little with regard to say about their intrinsic natures. I remain sort of puzzled by this, and I want to point a worry about it in a little bit. Let me zip back for a second. So here's one view that you might sort of glom into. You know, we've sort of pointed to earlier certain kinds of aesthetic engagement somebody could have with Orphans, like vampire. You know, we can think about preferring Nightcrawler to vampire. You can think about the way in which vampire raises these sort of interesting questions about, I don't know, vampirism. And one sort of first response that I think the fictional realist has, I think this is, you know, the easiest thing to say is like, look, Orphans have literally no interesting natures over and above their kind of causal historical properties. Like all there is to say about what Batman is like internally is that Batman is this famous thing, was created in 1939 by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, and there's just not much of an intrinsic nature to this thing. And what happens when we engage with Orphans or fictional characters more generally is we find audiences and artists are subject to these kind of widespread mistakes. They believe that these characters have these broad classes of properties, like having a blue cowl or what have you, but they're just wrong. And so the mistake theory, its way of trying to make sense of these fictional orphans would be to say, look, Cockrum is saying all these things about the aesthetics of vampires, but vampire has none of these properties. Vampire has very, very little that's vampirically interesting. There's sort of no intrinsic nature whatsoever. But here's the thing that's sort of puzzling. Our default way of making sense of what would make vampire interesting is that vampire is ascribed various features by the fictions in which vampire appears. But if vampire appears in no fictions, it starts to become very unclear how we could adopt this kind of mistake theory. I hope that sort of puzzle makes a little bit of sense, right? So the mistake theory is a natural thing to deploy when we've got our kind of standard case of a fictional work and the characters in which they appear, because we can just say, look, there's nothing interesting about Ego the Living Planet. There's all these things that are interestingly ascribed to Ego the Living Planet, that Ego the Living Planet might encode. The weirdness of Orphans consists in the fact that they're supposed to be appearing in the absence of fictions, so it's not clear that we can ascribe to them any properties. So the mistake theory looks to be in trouble with regard to its sort of standard application of the sort of fictional realist toolkit. Oh boy. So I'm worried about the mistake theory. I want to try and float another kind of option for how we might sort of work through this. And, you know, I think a general constraint here is that one thing we don't want to say about fictional characters, much less orphans, is we can't start imbuing them with these incredibly rich intrinsic natures that they somehow magically get from reality. Like these are artifacts. To the extent that they're artifacts, the properties that they would have are properties that we imbue them with somehow. and that to the extent that we could ascribe them or for them to be exemplified by abstract entities, it needs to be the case that we can make sense of how the kind of practices around them would generate those features. So I just want to note here, like, you could have this view where fictional characters each have distinctive intrinsic qualitative natures that separate them from each and every other one. But if you think that these things are abstract artifacts, it's just not clear that the practices surrounding fiction would somehow magically encode each of them with these spicy intrinsic natures that set them apart from every other one. So there is a kind of naturalistic constraint that you need to explain where they get these properties from on the basis of the stories we tell and the critical practices we engage with. Okay, thinking a little bit more about what I'll call sort of orphan aesthetics, how to think about our sort of engagement with these things. I think there's this natural thesis that emerges as sort of initially attractive that we'll walk back, called the mediation thesis. So the idea is like any access to or engagement with characters is mediated through our engagement with the works in which they appear. So to think about Batman is to think about this broadly natureless abstract entity through the properties according that he has according to the Batman fiction. Okay? Now, we actually know that one of the reasons fictionalism is attracted is that there's at least some unmediated kinds of access we get to Batman. So you can think about unmediated linguistic character-focused practices. So when we have a debate about who owns Batman, or you're suing me for the use of Batman, we're not in that context, as it were, engaging with the character in terms of the properties according to which that he has according to the fiction. So at least with regard to our linguistic engagement of characters, we can have this relatively unmediated access. The weird case about comics, and the one that I worry a lot about, is what I'll call the sort of pictorial mediation thesis. So any pictorial access to characters is mediated through our engagement with the works in which they appear. Right now, the pictorial mediation thesis is a very attractive thesis if the ontology of fiction is well behaved. If, as it were, characters do depend upon the works in which they appear, give me any character, there's going to be some truths according to the fiction. And when we present the character, we can present the character in such a way that it's mediated by the features that they have according to the fiction, right? One kind of entailment of the pictorial mediation thesis is roughly any drawing of Batman is a fiction, because Batman doesn't have the properties Batman is presented as having. There's just no depiction of Batman per se. There's, as it were, too little to depict. One can merely present something like a part of a fiction that somehow succeeds in presenting Batman. Orphans, of course, are a problem for that way of thinking about the presentation of characters. So just our datum, if you think that vampire is being presented here, and vampire is this thing that exists in the absence of a fiction, then comic orphans are depictable. And so we're left with this sort of puzzle. Do we have what we would think of as unmediated pictorial access? Am I looking at a character with features that it's taken to have, but they're not the features that it has according to a fiction? I'm somewhat tempted by this hypothesis. I think the way that it sort of shakes out is this kind of claim that you get what I call narrowly non-fictional drawings of fictional characters. So the idea here is that this is not a work of fiction, because vampire is an orphan. That doesn't mean it's accurately presenting vampire. It's as it were, a non-fictional drawing in the narrow sense of just not being a fiction, but it's nevertheless a presentation of a fictional character as it occurs outside of a fiction. Which leaves us in this tremendously weird circumstance of what to say about what we're seeing when we see these putative orphans, these things that would exist outside of fictions. Here's one story I kind of like, I'll just race through it. If our access to orphans is unmediated, then our engagement with them isn't a function of the properties which they're ascribed by according to a fiction. So what are we doing? What are we looking at? As it were, we can't use our sort of standard fictional realist analytic apparatus of saying that there's the properties they instantiate and the properties that they encode or ascribe. I think one thing that we can say, and it maybe points to sort of the way we do the ontology of other abstract entities, is that orphans instantiate a distinctive class of normative properties. They have properties like to be drawn effishly. And that property is sort of familiar, vaguely familiar normative property. They have that property in the absence of being F. And what depiction means for orphans is depicting orphans as being F is a means for depicting their instantiation of these normative properties. So what it is to draw a vampire as having wings is an effort to represent the property that the vampire is to be drawn with wings or wingishly. The idea here is that the orphan's properties are sort of conferred or transmitted via practice. That is one thing you're doing when you're trying to sort of gin up some characters for a story, is you're, as it were, producing this kind of instructional manual for the deployment of these characters. So it makes sense that these normative properties about their apt use are floating around. And then one arguably nice thing is that you could tell this story about the properties orphans have, and then still go on to think that broadly speaking, more engaging sort of the fictional realist framework, that we do typically care more about what things are like according to fictions rather than the sort of weird class of normative properties that they have, that they literally instantiate. Here's one weird upshot. I think, look, fictional realism is tremendously powerful in a pleasantly circumscribed range of cases, but there's something very strange about what it requires us to say with regard to our encounters with broader visual culture. What we're forced to say when we see a shirt like this is that this is a shirt depicting Batman, which is a character with no intrinsic properties of real note, purely historical, kind of vaguely legalistic properties. But there is a fiction according to Batman that's somehow presented on this shirt. I think that that's an uncomfortable position for the fictional realist to hold. I think it yields this really profligate view about fictions popping up all over the place. I think that's the kind of result that it starts to make Waltonian views look more attractive. One thing that would be nice about the sort of story I've tried to sketch vaguely about Orphans is that it suggests the possibility of kind of unmediated pictorial access to certain characters. It's not one that involves us saying that Batman in fact has the property of being human, but Batman does have the property of this normative property of to be drawn humanishly. And that could be the kind of thing that we might be interested in explaining why we want to see Batman appearing sort of so pervasively in visual culture. Okay, let me stop there. So just brief summing up. So apologies for this super speedy and admittedly quite strange tertiary section of the talk. Main takeaways for us. Baked into fictional realism are these theses about creation and dependence that link characters and works. I think they've warrant more discussion than they've gotten, and I think once we look to sort of comic book creative practice, it starts to look like they're actually not very plausible, or at least they're under fire. This does, I think, put broader pressure on the idea that there's this kind of orderly internal ontology of fiction, that characters and stories hang together in sort of exclusive and exhaustive ontological categories. But one thing I would note is that fictional realism might depend more than we'd like to admit on the kind of tidiness of the metaphysical framework to do its explanatory work. And we can kind of see how Orphans start generating these problems because they violate these theses of creation dependence, and it's not clear how to roll out the analytic part of the fictional realist framework, this apparatus of what they're like intrinsically versus what they're like according to fiction. There's a lot of ways to resist the case of Orphans, maybe via microfictionalism or just digging in your heels in the sort of Kripkean sense that no, you don't get a character until the book comes out. But I think all of them involve kind of contravening practice in ways that are maybe self-undermining. I think the reason to really warm up to fictional realism is because you want to take the practice seriously, to try and make sense of what people are saying when they write articles like the one we saw about Marvel Man. But if you're going to kind of go in and sort of retroactively do metaphysical surgery on these hypotheses, it starts to look a little bit weirder why one would accept fictional realism in the first place. So thanks so much. Just looking forward to getting everybody's kind of thoughts on this stuff and chopping it up the fate of fictional realism. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sam, for your excellent presentation, for your excellent talk. I have several questions, but I see there is a line of raised hands here. So we'll start taking them. Peter, just a moment that I have to allow you to unmute yourselves. There you go. Peter, please.
Yeah, I had a question already during the presentation. I wonder what you mean by fictional realism, but actually realism is a term referring to Courbet, for instance. So it's a stream in European aesthetics. And what you are talking about also includes sci-fi, or maybe especially about sci-fi now, like superheroes, like Swampman as well. Swampman is discussed by Davidson. Yeah, I wonder the same question as yesterday. Do you think it makes sense to make a difference between realism in the sense of Courbet and sci-fi realism? So I've made a presentation about thought experiments, and if you look into the literature of thought experiments, you may see there are more objections to sci-fi thought experiments like Twin Earths and Swampman than there are to realist thought experiments. So philosophers still may think the 19th century distinction between realism of Cicero, for instance, Richard Nixon, as mentioned by Kripke, is different from sci-fi realism. And the second question is, I guess that the superheroes of today relate to the mythology of, like the people needed a mythology in Greek days, in Roman days, with Zeus and Apollo, they still need a mythology of superheroes now. And of course, I want to answer the question about how Mesoamerica, how Latin America may improve on European mythology is, of course, by the Aztec mythology. Yeah, Aztec mythology, Incan mythology, Maya mythology has also many mythological entities. Yeah, some of them can fly and so on. So it could also be comparable to the Mesoamerican mythology.
Yeah. So I intend realism in I think the somewhat dreary, narrow metaphysical sense that it's, if you could think about sort of realism as delineating a class of philosophical hypotheses that affirm the existence of certain things. So I mean fictional realism in the sort of same sense that one might mean mathematical realism, just insofar as it would be the view that mathematical entities exist. There are, of course, tremendously interesting questions about realism as a style, a genre, a sort of literary value that would impact different kinds of assessments of form and so on. I don't think anything I've said here bears directly upon what we ought to say about the kind of epistemology of thought experiments, though, you know, Nathaniel Goldberg is on the call, and I don't think anybody's written more about sort of comics and thought experiments than Nathaniel and Chris. But so there's just not too much to say with regard to the sort of broader question of realism as a trend. I just mean in that sort of narrow sense. And then, yeah, there's well-trod theoretical ground about how to think about the relationship between the depiction of superheroes and deities of various sorts. I confess to having no substantial, well-considered views about how to sort that out. It's one of the nice things about doing sort of weird metaphysics rather than the sort of investigation of human culture. So apologies for the sort of, I think, a triumvirate of unsatisfactory answers to three really interesting questions, but thank you, Peter.
Right, thank you. Let's hear from Italo a question.
I think Nat and Professor Voltolini are ahead in front of me.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Nate, please. Yes, I have a different order here. So Nate, please. Yes. Yes. Okay. Here you go.
Thank you, Sam. This is wonderful. What a pardon me. What a pleasure to get to Zoom with you and hopefully in person. Talk to you too. I'm going to try to keep it short to just a question, but first on the salmon point, what he says about Kripke, I'm just wondering whether Salmon's remembering what he heard in seminar class with Kripke, because that's what Kripkeans and people like Salmon say, right? They're not always directly reporting, but
yeah, I think that's got to be right.
Yeah, but I think you're right in not taking the paradigmatic 19th century British novel as the example of all literature, but I think you could even extend the point further. And I guess here's a way of saying there's another prejudice in the philosophy of fiction, and that is to disregard the entire body of mythology, which doesn't have necessarily canonical form. And when Kripke wants to hang his hat on the notion of a final draft of something, there are no final drafts of many ancient works, right? Hesiod sort of gives us something or other of Greek mythology, but even then, so who knows whether our version of Gilgamesh was actually the final draft, or whether it even makes sense to say that it had a final draft. And even further, I'm not so sure that novels are so neatly delineated the way that that we folk think that they always are. So novels go through editors, as we all know. They often have silent co-authors. And here's another point, but then I do actually have a particular question. But here's another point about that. I've been doing some work on the construction of historical works in philosophy, and Manfred Kuhn, in his biography of Immanuel Kant, claims that the Critique of Pure Reason should be understood as a co-authored work. Right, mind blown, right? So it's not really, because Kant read aloud with Thomas Green, this English merchant, with whom,
okay. Huh.
Yeah, with whom Kant apparently enjoyed taking afternoon naps. And I shall leave it at that, because I don't know enough about the history
That's
of it.
the thing everybody's going to remember from this session.
But that's just to say that your work is really important, because not only is it showing us that we have a prejudice against standard fiction, but I think it's showing that we have maybe a misunderstanding of the way that much literature is created. In fact, not even fiction. But having said all that, here's my question. Can we nevertheless, for heuristic reasons, take final draft or publication or so-called canonical version as what's relevant, not because it has some metaphysical status, but because we have limited epistemic status? So we're only going to look at the actual version of, I don't know, Deadpool that gets published, and not versions that found their way on the cutting room floor, because, there could be an infinite number of those versions. So let's not do metaphysics, let's do like epistemic heuristics, and just realize, to the broader point, that the metaphysics of all of this is really messy.
Awesome. Thanks, that was great. Let me, two vague gestures, because those are just good problems to think through, and I'm not going to have systematic answers to them. But I think one thing that's sort of interesting in the sort of philosophy of fiction stuff is that there's kind of two weird parallel debates happening that sometimes interact. One is this question about the aesthetic evaluation, and one is about the kind of what I'll call the alethic evaluation. So thinking about what's sort of true according to versus what we should think about as sort of aesthetic merits. And these kind of function along sort of weird parallel tracks at various times. But there are clearly forms that we tend to think of are sort of radically indeterminate with respect to certain features, but determined with respect to others. So I'm thinking about sort of improv in jazz, for example. Like we think that there's a rich story to tell about the aesthetics of certain kind of improvised works, even when we think that there's a radical kind of indeterminacy. But when it comes to sort of thinking about fiction, there is this sense in which we desperately want kind of a lethic determinacy alongside this sort of aesthetic one. And it's just, you're right that our sort of diet is this kind of paucity of different fictive forms. And yeah, a broader diet is, I think, pretty important if we wanted a plausible account. So that's just when we get to the first one. With respect to that, I think, broader methodological point, like how should we be trying to systematize? So if we're doing fictional ontology, we're engaging this enterprise of trying to build a kind of metaphysics or fiction. What kind of data should we incorporate into the construction of that? And one idea is that we sort of idealize our data before we generate the metaphysical theories for it. And the idea is that you want to take, as it were, the sort of sanitized versions of everything and then run our fictional ontology, rather than trying to make sense of the sort of internal messiness of the practice, right? I think some of this is a weird holdover where from the kind of Kripkean metaphysics, philosophy of language stuff, where no, we have to take pretty much any anecdote about how we speak or talk and come up with a sort of systematic account of what's going on in those cases. And that does sort of tie us to a sort of sets the bar really high for what it would mean to sort of have a plausible metaphysics of fiction. So I am sort of tempted about this idea of like, to cast aside all these sort of weird, maybe non-canonical cases or the kind of preliminary cases. But I do think that when it comes to, for example, the philosophy of mathematics, that we should be committed to the messiness of it, that we want to make sense of the broadest range of phenomena possible. So while the kind of simplifying tendency to say, I'm just going to focus not on drafts, but on final manuscripts, et cetera, final published versions. I guess it would bespeak a kind of metaphysical impatience to go that route, but it might also be the sort of most epistemically coherent and sane one. Thank you. That's really interesting.
Okay, thanks. Alberto?
Thanks a lot, Sam. This is very interesting, and it made me thought again on issue that I dealt with some years ago. I am in favor, against what you said, the reversion of the dependence relation between characters and works. For it seems to me that if we try to understand what are the identity conditions for works, you can concoct a series of thought experiments that show that the only thing that differs between two fictional works that we recognize as being distinct is that they contain a different character. So, for instance, to give you an example, which is a modification of the Menard case, suppose that you have Cervantes on Earth and you have twin Cervantes on twin Earth, and they write what syntactically is the same story, and they ascribe exactly the very same property to what one would say, well, the only thing that differs seems to be the character. Or one might say, well, but in this case, one still has the difference between, say, Cervantes on the one hand and twin Cervantes on the other, but you can just modify the example and have, say, Cervantes is a sort of dissociated author that writes two times, so to speak, two syntactically identical stories, one at time t and the other one at time t prime, for instance. And again, one would say, if we accept the idea that in these cases the two works differ, the only thing that differs in these two cases is just the character, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that the sort of dependence that is involved here is a dependence that put the character in the identity conditions of a fictional work. And this would have the advantage in a way that, in a certain sense, allows for a possibility also to say that there is a sort of generic dependence of characters on stories, so to speak. In order for one to have a character, there must be some story or other. This is quite compatible with the idea that, in point of fact, a certain particular story depends on a certain character for its own identity. So just I'm curious about your reactions about that.
No, that's great. I've been thinking about sort of similar stuff. Let me, so I'm happy to accept the kind of modal claim about the essential distinctness of those sorts of fictions. And I think that it's really plausible that it might be traced back to the characters if you're a kind of fictional realist. I guess the thing that I would want to resist is that that's one of those cases where you've got an essential or kind of modal tie, but I would want to resist positing the further thesis of metaphysical dependence, the kind of something like grounding, right? Because that's the kind of, I think this analogy might not hold up, but if we start thinking about the parallel kind of musical work examples, where we might think that there's sort of sound-alike works composed by different composers, we might think that they have their composer essentially, but in that case, we'd sort of resist the further metaphysical hypothesis of that the work depends upon the character. So I think those are the cases that when we start trying to get our hooks on the notion of dependence, we start using phenomena like modal phenomena like essence to try and derive them. And that's a very powerful classical way to do it. But I think when we look under the hood for these sorts of examples, my inclination is to say, yes, essentially distinct, yes, distinct in virtue of the characters, but I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that the work depends upon the characters. So like that's the right challenge, right? If you did want to insert characters as kind of fundamental. The weirder case, and then there's a sort of second piece about like, what should we think about characterless fictions? Pretty, it's sort of funny, right? Because, Hannah did a great job sort of walking us through the sort of weird outline case of fictions, like sort of Fiction Unlimited and then empty fictions. The other day, it's sort of like, in the realm of like not that weird is just these kinds of like Beckett style fictions of the room, empty, gray, cold, etc. I can imagine that very dreary, woeful fiction as being characterless. But that's how I kind of want to push back on the sort of dependence of work on character piece. So I can see different ways of thinking about storytelling practices that might try and reinstall it, right? Like if you really do think that storytelling is in its most sort of nascent primal way, this kind of practice of telling things about things, and then anything like this kind of Beckett example I sort of gave is a really degenerate, cooked up, avant-garde sort of style fiction, there's a way that you could look to practice and start saying, no, characters are the most fundamental things. So nothing here I've sort of has I think fully militated against that view, but that's how I resist it. Does that make sort of sense? As just
definitely. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question.
Hannah?
Yeah, thank you. Sam, that was really fun. I appreciate it. I guess just convenient timing with the characterless fiction bit. While I was listening to you, it occurred to me that any of these puzzles that we have about characters and orphans and whether they're dependent on works or not, it doesn't need to be a fictional person. I think this problem would arise for any fictional object. So like, yeah, fictional objects, fictional settings, like places, even maybe like fictional concepts. Like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like magic spells from Harry Potter or something. So I don't know. I think you might be right that there's something central about characters and storytelling kind of practices, but in terms of the philosophical puzzles that arise, there's nothing special about characters. So that it might be interesting just to see like what kinds of questions come up once we think about like non-persons or just ficta in general. But that was just like a piggyback comment. Two things. One,
can you talk about that one just for a second.
Oh yeah, sorry.
And then you guys, the other two. Yeah, I mean, it's not hard to think of these sorts of examples where I think fictional properties are sort of good ones, like sort of, I don't know, being a Horcrux or whatever it is, right? There is this kind of weirdness of metaphysical ties between properties and entities, right? So I guess the thing that I think is interesting about the character piece is that it's probably a little bit illuminating to think about comic storytelling in this species as being highly character focused, and that's why the artifact emerges there. I guess the general question I've had when I thought about it is sort of like, can I think about another species of storytelling that would valorize other categories of ficta? Like I was sort of like, my bad example was like these kind of like Patrick O'Brien sort of naval stories where there's kind of like fictional ships. So I'm super curious if anybody thinks of other examples like that where there's a robust enough examples from the kind of practice that involve broader fictive orphans.
Yeah, I guess sci-fi comes to mind with like fictional technologies being like the focus in a sustained manner, but I can think of others. The terminology thing, if you don't like orphan or unemployed, I've been trying to think of other suitable ones. Like offstage characters is one that came to mind, or like shy characters also came to mind. Ziddy was just like,
that's so much more pleasant than unemployed orphan.
Yeah, so I mean, if it's helpful, you can use them. But sorry, like finally, my actual question, it's quick. One of the dependence theses was just that fictional characters are dependent on fictional works. And so the orphan case is supposed to show one issue with that thesis, but I think there's another one, which is just that I don't think characters are dependent on works on an ongoing basis, even if they are dependent kind of initially as like a condition on creation. And so I guess the question was, do you agree with that once they come into existence because of work, they can have their own life? So for instance, they can show up at other places in different works, right? Show up in different medium. And if so, it seems like we would have to clarify that dependence relations. Like it's actually not a dependence relation so much as it's a creation condition.
Yeah, I mean, my answer could be super unsatisfactory just because these are tremendously difficult questions about which I don't have super considered views, where it's like, on the one hand, we get sort of, do we want to posit, so here's one claim you might have, that if we do think that characters have sorts of interesting essential properties, one of them might be medium specificity, right? That is, there's a sense in which Superman in the comics is just a fundamentally different character from Superman in the movies. And so there's the idea that we can't transport characters across media in that way, that they're sort of, they're maybe counterpart-like in their relationships or just fundamentally distinct in various ways. But then we can also think about the case where within the same sort of medium, we might have characters moving across different kinds of works. That one ends up becoming super vexed for all sorts of familiar reasons about authority. And I don't know of any potent argument that could show you couldn't transport characters across, but across the media or specific works. But I also don't know of a really compelling argument that you could. I think that there's just an array of pretty attractive ways of being a fictional realist, some of which tether characters to the works in which they originally appear. I mean, what do you think about these sort of cases? I mean, do you think that Superman, as he appears across all these sorts of media, is one and the same character? And I just don't have any hunch about it.
Yeah. I mean, so I think it depends. Like, if it's in a medium where there are particular formal features or structural features that are really hard to replicate in other mediums, and if those formal features contribute something essential to the character, then it might be the case. So, for instance, like, this is going to be a good example, but like, imagine a comic book character and we're trying to describe them just in prose, right? It's going to be really hard to try to get to the same kind of essential feature with that. So that's one example I have in mind, but take like Romeo and Juliet, like that's been told in so many different mediums, so successfully, it's so recognizable. It seems like just kind of blanket arguments about medium specificity. I think the burden is going to be on that side of the argument, that it's impossible to do this or really difficult to do this, because I think in critical practice, we do it all the time. I guess that's my beginning intuition. And like, characters travel so much and they change forms, I mean, with prequels and sequels. And so like, I think those add a lot of maybe fun complexity to this little question.
Yeah. It would certainly, I mean, just making sense of like the nature of adaptation, the ways in which different characters can sort of be aptly recognized in different medium. It is hard to imagine not accepting the sort of identity of these characters across those examples. So again, like anything that you can do with identity, you can do with counterpart theory. So I always worry about the prospects of those sorts of views. But I guess just to circle back to your initial question, it was sort of this worry like, look, we shouldn't accept the dependence thesis independently. And that's because there's just going to be cases in which these characters exist independently of the sort of the relevant work. I guess one would still probably want to accept, fictional realists that I'm sort of imagining would say that, and this is where you get these sort of weird claims about, no, somehow the work needs to continue existing or be in principle recoverable in the world. Like those, issue for another day. Thank you. That's really useful stuff to think about. Apologies for not having a more refined response.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Iago?
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, now I can talk. Thank you, Sam. It was awesome. I think I always have had a deep desire to ask a question about Nightwing in a philosophy talk, and I can do it now.
Nightwing's back. This is a good year for Nightwing.
First, I want to piggyback on Hannah's questions and ask about some stuff like the All-Star series, where you kind of have the same character, but it's cut out of the canon. So you seem to have like another character entirely. Would this be a problem for creationists? I don't know.
Yeah. Right. So maybe I mean, sort of with the advent of the emergence of the multiverse as kind of like part of the sort of general culture of storytelling, now we've got these really strange hypotheses with regard to trying to make sense of what's going on in these sorts of examples. I mean, if you just look to comic practice, the preponderance of evidence is going to support the idea that there's a numerical distinctness of these characters that we'll just call them alternative characters, right? So you can think about All-Star Superman or sort of Elseworlds Batman or what have you. But it's a weird kind of retroactive case insofar as the popularity of those characters is distinct from the kind of main continuity characters, and sort of fact that they end up bumping into one another suggests that they're in fact numerically distinct. I think if you actually wanted to make meaningful headway on this, that's not just kind of like trying to pull some weird hunches about narrative, is that you could actually look to creator credits. So what you'd find is when somebody creates like, I don't know, Gwenpool, the sort of Gwen Stacy version of Deadpool, the creation of that character is attributed to somebody other than like Liefeld as the creator of that character. So I guess like, you know, I think the only thing that I have to say that's really maybe potentially vaguely insightful is that we should probably be hesitant about deploying our hunches regarding the isolation and unification of fictional worlds and the identity and a distinctness of characters on the basis of sort of these narratological facts, and try and look to the most sort of ground floor critical practices. And those are going to be the ones that involve who gets the credit for the creation. Which, yeah, so sorry it's not a sort of a better answer. I'm pretty vexed by those.
But it's a weird question also, so. But no. Can I ask my real question now, Jersey? Or maybe, okay. So I was thinking about Nightwing and how like Dick Grayson was a character that was created by someone, and we have like the character Dick Grayson, Robin and stuff like that. And then we have Nightwing, who's credited to be created by someone else. I don't remember who. I can't read now. I don't remember who created Nightwing.
Probably the
yes, in Judas contract. So how do you deal with this kind of stuff? Because you don't seem to be creating a new artifact. You seem to be just dressing Dick Grayson in some new clothes, but you also have new creative credits. I don't know, maybe even a new copyright credit. Who created Nightwing?
Awesome. I love this puzzle. This is actually one that we tackle a little bit in the book. So here's the guys of the puzzle that I like. So in the late 60s, Steve Ditko and Steve Skates create this team, Hawk and Dove. They're kind of goofy and bad. And then in the mid 80s, there's this massive crossover event where this character Monarch just starts killing the crap out of all these superheroes. So Skates and Ditko create Hawk. And then I think it's Dick Giordano and like Tom Palmer or something like that create Monarch. But the Monarch is this character that figures in this large crossover. And then the 6th issue, it's revealed that Monarch is Hawk. And so now we end up with this puzzle where it looks like we want to say that Monarch is identical to Hawk according to fiction. We want to say that Hawk was created by Ditko, and we want to say that Monarch was created by Giordano. So what do we say about these kinds of cases, right? I'm inclined to say in these sorts of cases that 2 characters have been created, but it's true according to the fiction that they're identical. So you can have facts about identity and distinctness in the fiction can come apart from facts and identity separable from, as it were, facts about the identity and distinctness of characters are separable from facts about the identity and distinctness within the fiction. So in this, that's how I would want to kind of handle the Nightwing case, where yeah, you've created 2 characters, and then according to fiction, they're the same. That is exactly a way that gives precedent to the critical practice, the creator side, the fictional generation activity stuff over the narrative side, which is weird. I mean, one's got to go, but that's the way we go in the book. Does that make some sense? Just the idea where it's 2 characters, but they're the same according to the story. Oh, you're.
Okay, yeah, that was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really great.
Nice. So I guess this is related to what Iago was asking, but I wonder what are some examples of, I wonder if there are examples in which copyright disputes are settled sort of against our intuitions about origin essentialism, let's say against the idea that the creator is fully responsible for for the character or something like that. I don't know. Or are all copyright disputes settled in line with origin essentialism?
Oh, I mean, I do. So Darren Hudson Hick has written some really great stuff about sort of the sort of aesthetics and ethics of copyright. I mean, the sad truth is that there's copyright law is not sensitive to metaphysics in the way one would hope, and it's even less sensitive to ethics. So this is just the case in which the sort of standard disputes about copyright end up unfolding under question of whether one is engaging in work for hire, in which when one effectively does work for hire, contractually speaking, they end up surrendering relevant copyright claims to these characters. So that's why, most famously, Siegel and Schuster just got hosed by DC Comics, but there's characters that are buried in potter's fields because there's just no attentiveness to the sort of actual credit which these folks deserve. I mean, one thing that is really interesting, and I'll zip back to this for here. I'll share my screen again. So, the most, oh boy. All the way back here. So, you can think about for example, the history of the creation of Spider-Man is what Ditko is trying to work through in this sort of example. So Spider-Man sort of standardly credited to Steve Ditko and Stan Lee. A weird thing that sort of happens in advance of Stan Lee actually drawing the comic is Jack Kirby takes a stab at Spider-Man, and then somewhat shockingly, Stan Lee kind of sends it back, and then Ditko sort of takes it up. And so there's this question where Lee is sort of running around saying, well, I've got this character Spider-Man and I need somebody to draw him. And then Kirby sort of takes a stab at it, and then it's sort of poo-pooed. You might think that there's, and then subsequently sort of Ditko takes another stab at it, and then it's eventually published. So there's an enormous amount of sort of historical dispute about what the actual circumstances of this creation are. But it's actually the kind of case where you do get that sort of vagueness that I think it was Alex maybe was talking about the other day, just like, well, do I want to say that Kirby Spider-Man is distinct from Ditko Spider-Man, or is this an initial kind of working through of Spider-Man through the first pass? If you do think that sort of Kirby worked on Spider-Man, could a process that skipped Kirby and went straight to Ditko have yielded the same Spider-Man? That's, if you are this kind of origin essentialist, what you're going to envision is that the character, as it were, needs to come from the same creative material. So I guess the block of wood analogy here is, so if you think about sort of Kripke's table and block of wood, the characters, as it were, or the creators are the block of wood and the character is the table. I think it's highly indeterminate what to say about the essential features of these characters. I would accept the ones I think Alberto, I'm very tempted by Alberto's sort of examples of certain relationships between essential features of works and characters. But when it gets to this case of like, could somebody else have created Ditko's Spider-Man? I'm not sure what to say. I am not sure what to say. What do you think?
Yes, I'm very anti-origin essentialist, anti-origin essentialism, but and I like the idea of the process, especially in comics and other media. In film, you have character design, which is a very complicated, and I like the idea of the normativity of. I think you presented in one of the last slides the idea that there is something of a template for other artists to work upon. And so perhaps we can think that there is some essential dependence on, if any at all, on this sort of template. But then once the template gets settled, it has normative force over subsequent artists that work with the same character. I don't know, but I would say that I think there's obviously the idea of a character sheet. I don't know if it's a common practice in comics as well. I know that it is a thing in concept art, right? So the character sheet is the normative driving force for for whatever essential properties we may have, something like that. So I would try to coax essential properties in terms of normative properties of practices, right?
Yeah, it's it's a great question. The one thing I do kind of like about the sort of this way of treating orphans is having these normative properties is that you could imagine sort of the normative force of how we're supposed to treat these fictional characters emerging both in the kind of initial practice of creation by imbuing them with these normative properties, but then once the work gets produced, that's a kind of arguably overriding source of the ways in which we ought to think and talk about these characters. I mean, one argument for going in on kind of origin essentials and with respect to these characters is just that general problem where if fictional realism is true, they're so sparse with regard to the features that they might have that individuating them proves so difficult. They sort of get these sort of no really interesting intrinsic properties. There's just these causal historical ones. So to the extent that we think that we can that they be the kind of objects that we even worth having aesthetic attitudes towards or giving a shit about, it starts looking like we should probably imbue them with as rich features as possible. But I do think that this is probably one of those cases too where it starts to look like once you expand your diet of forms for fictional storytelling, any kind of stable thesis about essentialism starts to just look really tough to sustain, like across all fictions. But yeah, I mean, maybe we should just be weirdly provincial and only focus on the sort of metaphysics of comic book characters. That's probably not the soundest of philosophical maneuvers.
Great, thanks. So we have a last question, okay, from Chris.
Okay, so my English is not very good, so if I can find the words I'm gonna ask for Italo or Jerzy translate the question for me. But I think of this example of the media of games, a game called Shadow of the Colossus. Is a game of supposedly the original game would have 24 Colossus or the enemies of the game, but in the final cut, this number passed for 16 or 14, I can remember. But we know that because of an act of data mining the gamers make in the code of the game, and found lines of code that are like traces that existence of this other Colossus. So these lines of codes are like a proof of the existence of these characters. These cards are orphan characters too, like are a type of similar characters like orphans cards of this story in the comic books, or are different in
that's awesome.
Some other way.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, let me just kind of think aloud about some of the sort of analogies and disanalogies, right? So there might be just different kinds of critical practices that surround the two kinds of fictions. There is this super deep question about what is a video game, and what constitutes the, as it were, the principal source of alethic facts about the video game, right? One can imagine that the code might not be the most apt place to look, but rather in the sort of like possible ways of playing through it. It's definitely not the case that so one analogy between the sort of code and the kind of what I'll call the sort of ephemera that's produced around comics production is that we do tend to think that it sort of informs the ontology we want to build around it. So I guess I'm just trying to think of what I would want to say about the Shadow of the Colossus case. It's like, I guess I would probably say that there's a weird relationship between draft works and actual works in the case of video games, where probably want to assimilate it to some kind of unfully vetted manuscript somehow. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What I just sort of did is commit this cardinal sin that I began the talk by disclaiming. As I said, I want to take this weird sort of fictional storytelling and make it as much like the standard case as possible by saying that it's like a text. So I apologize for that. But yeah, I mean, the deeper analogy here is that it looks like there are practices around the production of works. And some of those practices do seem to require, in order to make sense of them, the idea of producing unused ficta, right? So the 19th Colossus or Vampire. And so maybe this is just a nice sort of example where it's like the unused ficta are probably a broader category than one might think. That's a great question. I hope that's sort of I'd like to think more about that. I've watched the screen caps of Shadow of Colossus and desperately want to play it, but I'm an old person with a small child.
Okay, thanks for the answer. I really think these presentations are very inspiring for me because I am a fan of comic books by myself. So thanks for the presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Yes, cheers. So thanks once again, Sam, for the excellent presentation. We'll be back at 2 p.m. Brazilian local time with a session of contributed papers, and then later this evening with Stephen Diablo's conference.